Okay, today I want to talk about something that's a real hot topic, especially with what all is going on in the Middle East with Israel and the war that's going on over there, and our country's connection with that. Antisemitism. How do you wrap your mind around that? Now, uh, it's amazing to me that often I run into people who have extreme views on the Jews or Israel, and oftentimes they've never known a Jew and they've never been to Israel, and they know very little about the Bible or the history of that nation. And so their understanding or their bias is based on misinformation. And there's a lot of that to go around, obviously. Now, I want to start with a passage of Scripture. Now, one thing that's really important is, the old idea that those that don't learn from history, they're destined to repeat it. And that's very much true throughout history. If you read the Old Testament, you see this ebb and flow of God's grace extended to the Jews, and then God judging the Jews. They ended up in Babylon for 70 years. Then you read the story about Esther, where God uses a woman, Esther, basically, to deliver the Jews from a guy named Haman, who was set out to kill them, right? Now, after the Jews came out of their 70 years in Babylon, there's a number of prophets that prophesied about events that were going to happen in the future. And I'm going to read a passage out of Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 2. It says, "Behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. And it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it." Now, we don't know exactly when this is going to happen, but it's obviously talking about in the last days. Now, how you define the last days is one of those sticky issues. And one of the things that's really important when you're reading the Bible is, and there's many different ways of studying the Bible. I mean, you can study the Bible from the perspective of a topic, or maybe you're going to study about the life of Abraham or Apostle Paul. And so to some extent, you have to cherry pick the verses that you rely upon. But it can be a dangerous way of studying the Bible if all you do is look for verses to support your prejudice or whatever view it is you might have. So just to quote just these few verses could leave us wanting. And if all you know about Jews is what you read in the Gospels about Pharisees and Sadducees, again, that can give you a biased perspective, because the Jews weren't always too nice to Jesus and his apostles and his followers. And if your understanding of the Jews is based on never knowing a Jew, a real live one, or if you grew up in an area where there was animosity against the Jewish community, or you had some bad experiences with Jews, obviously you're going to have, to some degree, a bias. And so it's really important to try to get a balanced view of what's going on. Now, what's going on in Israel today a lot of it is based on politics. And of course, we get a barrage of stuff in the news, pro and con, about Israel. But we have to admit that Jesus was a Jew. And if you don't understand that, you're in a world of hurt. And even though he spoke out against the Jews, and some people, they get the idea that, well, those nasty Jews, they crucified the Son of God. Well, Jesus, he went to the cross for a reason. It wasn't that it was against his will to go to the cross. He was predestined to be the Lamb of God. And it wasn't just the Jews that put him on the cross. The Romans were just as guilty as everybody else. So, he shed his blood for all of humanity. So to blame that on the Jews is again, it's a cherry picking way of reading the Bible, because we're all guilty of sin. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And he shed his blood for God's kingdom is not male or female or Jew or Greek. It's God's kingdom is extended to everyone who believes. Sometimes it's helpful to understand a little bit about church history and how the church as a whole dealt with the Jews, the non-believing Jews, and those that believed. And so there's been this ebb and flow of generosity extended to the Jews, and at other times pressure put upon them depending on what was going on in society. For example, Martin Luther, of course, he was a Catholic, right? And he rebelled against Rome because he could see that Rome had become a little bit corrupt, probably a little bit more than a little bit. And so he kind of had the idea that the reason the Jews didn't come to Christ was because of Rome's approach, that they were maybe a little too hard-hitting and too hard-handed, okay? So he tried his approach, and he tried to reach the Jews, and after about a decade or so, he began to see that they weren't as easy to reach as he thought they might be. So he eventually wrote On the Jews and Their Lies. So some pretty hard-hitting and critical writings about the Jews and how they reject Christ. So he started out being sympathetic in effort to reach the Jews, and then eventually he kind of gave up hope. And so the sad part about it is Hitler used some of Martin Luther's writings as a reason to clamp down on the Jews. The whole antisemitism again rising up. And then another issue that's interesting is in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Everybody knows that story. Well, leading up to that, the Muslims had invaded Spain in the year 711. Okay, so there was this tension going on in Spain for several hundred years. Now, during this time when the Muslims were in control of Iberia or Spain, oftentimes people converted to Islam just simply for business reasons, or they didn't want to pay the demi-tax, or maybe there was a marriage relationship or a business relationship. I mean, there's any number of reasons why people convert to certain religions. But then eventually what happened was, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Muslims. And of course that got all of Rome and all of the Christian Empire, the Roman Empire, that got them pretty worked up because they could see that they were going to be next. And so eventually what they did was they drove the Muslims out in 1492. But along with the Muslims, they drove out the Jews as well. And of course the reason for that is both the Muslims and the Jews were against the Trinitarian idea of God and the deity of Christ. Now, most Christians in the West, at least the way I was raised, when they think of the Inquisition, about all they know is people, oftentimes Christians, were persecuted by Rome because they wouldn't submit to the Pope. And much of that's true, obviously. But a lot of it had to do with the Arian heresy. There was, in Spain during that time, there were a lot of so-called Christians that didn't believe in the Trinity. They believed in a heresy called the Arian heresy, which is very similar to what the Jehovah's Witnesses adhere to today. And so Rome put pressure on those people, trying to find out really what they were about. And they weren't always honest. So, and of course, Rome went to extremes trying to sort some of this stuff out. And it obviously wasn't always fair the way they did it. It was brutal in some cases. But when they when they drove the Jews and the Muslims out, sometimes the Jews would end up in places like Venice or even back in Israel or in North Africa in little enclaves where the Muslims weren't too antagonistic against them, and they could agree that they didn't believe in the Trinity and they could probably get along, okay? So one interesting thing that's pointed out by, I've been reading this book, Constantine's Sword, by James Carroll, and he's an ex-Catholic guy, but he's done a lot of really good research on the history of the church, the Roman church. And one of the things that he pointed out is after 1492, some of the Jews ended up back in what became known as the ghetto outside of Venice. Now, what that was, they had a refinery, I think it was an iron refinery that was called a ghetto. And so that's where these Jews ended up living. I mean, it was a very desperate part of town. It was kind of the slums. But they eventually built it up because they're pretty industrious folks, right? And so that became kind of a picture of the way God and the church dealt with the Jews. He didn't want them to prosper. So they would, the church would kind of keep their thumb on them to keep them from getting out of control. And then sometimes when the Jews would fake conversion for political reasons, they would fake becoming a Christian, and then they would find out later that they would have an issue kind of like what Paul dealt with Peter in the little book of Galatians. You may remember in Galatians, Paul starts out with, if anybody comes and preaches another gospel, even if it's from an angel from heaven, let them be accursed. And then a few chapters later, you see him confronting Peter because some Jews had come to town, and Peter basically started adhering to the law again. And Paul confronted him and said, basically, you're saved by grace, not by works. So why is it that you're pretending to be a Jew all of a sudden? I mean, he was a Jew. He was raised a Jew, right? But he was putting himself back under the law. Now, Paul wasn't being anti-Semitic. He's just pointing out a theological problem. So, see, sometimes theological problems can turn into an ethnic problem or a prejudice, which is kind of a mixed bag. So when these Jews ended up in the ghetto outside of Venice, and another interesting thing came about. It's a linguistic thing. In Hebrew, you may have heard the word get. It's the word for divorce. So the word get became somewhat related to the word ghetto. Okay, so the people would see these people living in the ghetto, and they'd say, well, this is just nothing more than a picture of God divorcing his people. Okay, and then early on, around the 4th century or so, there was a struggle. Augustine had to deal with it, and later it shows up in the teachings of Martin Luther and Calvin and some of the reformers, which has become known as replacement theology. And the point being is, after about 400 years, everybody up to that point believed that there was going to be another temple built and the Jews would be restored and Israel would become a nation. It was pretty distraught during the Crusades. There was an ebb and flow of wars and battles between the Muslims and the Crusaders, for several hundred years there. But eventually, what it came down to was the church came up with this idea that God is no longer dealing with the Jews, that he had just written them off. And of course, that's not biblical. If you read the book of Romans, Paul deals with that in several chapters, I think 11 through 13 pretty much, that God hasn't cast away his natural people. And then he even warns us as believers that be careful that you don't get the wrong attitude here, because in the same way that he cut them off or gave them a hard heart, he can cut us off because we've been grafted in. So here's the danger, right? If you get a wrong attitude about God's natural people, God might deal with you. So this is the balancing act that our nation has in dealing with the nation of Israel. Now, it's difficult to know how all this fits in with the biblical picture and prophecy and stuff, and there's all kinds of people that write books about that, and I don't even pretend to predict what's going to happen over there. But one thing is for sure, God restored Israel in 1948 for a reason. That just didn't happen by accident. It's just quite a miracle that Israel is a nation with all the persecution and stuff that they've dealt with. But then we have this difficult situation now with all the Muslims that live around them, Now, Muhammad, of course, when he died in 632, and within 100 years, Islam had overtaken all of North Africa. They had invaded Spain. It's amazing what they accomplished, and it's all because of their tribal mentality that God had supposedly given them the endorsement to go convert the whole world to Muhammad's religion, so that everybody would pray to this rock in Mecca, the Kaaba, which is pretty ridiculous. But that's what the church has been dealing with since the days of Muhammad, and nothing's really changed. So we're not only having to deal with the difficulty of how to understand what God is doing with the Jews, but we have to understand what the devil is doing with this Islamic cult that's invading the rest of the world, invading the United States. And a lot of Americans have no idea what they're dealing with. They don't understand the history, they don't understand the theology, and all they know is what they hear in the news, and half of what you hear in the news is just propaganda.